Hello everyone, this is Ken Baldwin. I'm with LIG Marine, and I'm here today to go over care, custody, control exposures with you and try to make sure that I get you to understand how to cover these exposures properly. So today we will be going over Wharfinger's legal liability, landing owners' legal liability, landing dock bailee, which is almost the same as landing owners' legal liability. So we'll be going over that mostly together. And then Stevedore's legal liability, which is the liability of someone who's unloading the ship. And then terminal operator's liability, which is someone who may unload the ship and store cargo while their trucks wait to pick things up. So we'll be going over that today in all these different forms. The coverages we'll be going over, each will be separate. The major exclusions we will be going over for all the forms. Some policies have other exclusions, but most of the policies have common exclusions that I'll go over together. And then we'll go over when to use each of these forms. So the very common and very unique exclusions that are for all of the forms together are death and personal injury. This is just to cover the cargo and the items that people have in their care, custody, control, not to cover the personal injuries to people. Those are covered by the MGL. This is just to cover look at the exposures for the actual product that people are handling. So also any liability assumed under contract is not covered. It's just normal care, custody, control coverages that the general law would have you be liable for. Then, if you're working on a vessel, you wouldn't necessarily be anything with the flammable or combustible liquids if something happened to them, unless that you have definitely been following the NFPA or National Fire Protection Association rules and regulations. Then demurrage, loss of time, loss of freight, loss of charter, and or similar or substitute expenses. The policies cover the physical damage, but not necessarily loss of income for people that might have a loss of time if, let's say, the vessel is damaged and they don't have the ability then to carry on their work. This is just the legal liability for the actual damage caused and to fix the damage. Then any loss, damage, or expense which may be recoverable under any other insurance benefit of the insured, except as excess over and above the recoverable amounts thereunder. And then any other care, custody, control coverage. So for instance, if you had a ship repair's legal liability and some damage was done that wasn't covered by a ship repair's legal liability or was covered, let's say, in a warehouse legal liability, that would be excluded because it's not part of the care, custody, control and marine coverages. So the first one we're going to go over is the Wharfinger's legal liability. A Wharfinger is someone who's just having a vessel come on their dock and not necessarily repairing or doing anything. So what your coverage is the liability for physical loss of or damage to the vessel, the equipment on that vessel, any cargo on that vessel, and the freight, and any interest on board the vessel, and it includes the cost or expense of removing the wreck of such property. So for instance, if your vessel sank at the dock, you would be liable to the vessel, but you'd also be liable for getting the vessel on up. That would be covered by a Wharfinger's liability in general. The property of others would not be covered, or while such property is in the custody of the insured at their landing or mooring facility located at or on, actually. So it's a specific location that is covered. There may be multiple locations covered underneath this because some people have multiple Wharfingers and they allow people to dock at their vessel and to relax and kind of not unload or do anything there. It also covers any other physical loss or damage to property of others arising out of the custodianship of the vessel. So for instance, if you had a vessel that broke loose from the mooring because of the owner did something wrong, the Wharfinger owner, then any damage that that vessel did to property of others would be covered by the Wharfinger's policy. So Wharfinger's liability exclusions, all the normal care, custody, control exclusions that I read to you before, but also loss or damage or expense arising out of the operation of any vessel operated by the insured or any of the affiliates or subsidiaries. So if you're operating that vessel and hit something, it wouldn't be covered. No vessel repair, construction, or alteration, or gas freeing or conversion. It's not covering anything that you're doing to the vessel. It's just covering the vessel's liability standing there, kind of like just a docking exposure. However, many Wharfinger's form will cover bodily injury except for employees of the insured. You have to really, there's no standard form per se in the industry. Each form is slightly different. So you ought to be careful and watch and see what is there. They're very broad, and you should look and review the entire form before binding any coverages to make sure that you have what you need. Then we have landing dock bailee liability to go over. This is very much like Wharfinger's. You're covering the legal liability for loss or damage to vessel, craft, equipment, their cargo and freight, and other interests on board, which are in their care, custody, control in the vicinity of, at or in the vicinity of, and then there'll be a named location. It also covers the legal liability of the insured for damage to property other than that inferred to in the property caused by the vessel or craft or their cargoes which are in your care, custody, or control. So for instance, again, if you have a vessel that's docked at your location and it breaks away and damages someone else's vessel, the damage to that vessel would be covered, but not necessarily bodily injury or any kind of liability to people, or just damage to property or vessels or the crafts that the vessel actually damaged. The vessel that was in your care, custody, control damaged someone else's vessel. So when do you use these coverages? Well, the answer is you use them when someone is not doing much at their facility. They have a dock. They allow people to dock there. They may be having someone that is just, having a vessel put there for a short period of time because the owner of the vessel is not using the vessel and he doesn't want to, have it out in the ocean. He might have it just at the dock to be there to, wait until he has the opportunity to go and do something else. A lot of times it's for older vessels that are, almost ready to go to someplace to be fixed or something like that, or to end up being scrapped. That's what a Wharfinger's landing dock legal liability a lot of time is used for. So then we get to terminal operators and stevedores legal liability. These are much broader and much more difficult. They require a lot more information when you're placing them to make sure that everything is covered correctly. So a stevedore's legal liability is property damage to the watercraft and equipment, cargo, freight, and other interest on board, resulting from your insured's loading or offloading or unloading of the watercraft at the locations, including adjacent inland waters scheduled below. What that is actually a named location that you have, and you might have to have multiple locations on there because sometimes stevedores go to various locations. So make sure if you're placing this coverage that you ask your stevedore how many different places they work at. But this is covering any damage that the stevedore does to the actual watercraft or vessel that they are on the process of unloading. Let's say they swing a crane and it hits the vessel and causes damage. That's what this is for. Or they drop cargo as they're offloading it. It would cover the legal liability of the damage to the cargo owner and to the vessel owner, because he's probably still liable for it, but it's covering the stevedore's legal liability and for those damages done. Or if you actually had somebody that you were moving a little bit of freight around on the vessel and you damaged it, it would also be covered. Sometimes you're moving containers to get at a separate container that's below the one. You could damage that other container that you weren't even offloading, and it would still be covered under the stevedore's legal liability. And also covered underneath there is property damage to other watercraft, their cargo or freight, and any other fixed or movable object, interests or property of others arising out of the loading or unloading of watercraft covered above. What that would mean is, let's say, for instance, you are offloading a container and then you would drop something on another vessel as you're offloading it and damage that vessel. That's covered. Um, Also, if you offloading in something and you damage somebody's crane or something like that that's on the shore, it would be covered underneath the Stevedore's legal liability. The next is property damage to property of others occurring while such property is in the care, control, and custody of the insured, resulting or arising from the insured's operations or activities as a stevedore as a result of the location schedule in 1A above. That is, again, covering the stuff that's property of other people and in the insured's control, and they're operating in the activities, much like the last one that we had. Then cost or expense or incidental removal of wreck of watercraft covered under 1A above, and the equipment, cargo, and other interest on board while in the care, custody, control of the insured, when such removal is compulsory by law. It is agreed that such cost or expense shall be reduced by the net proceeds of salvage that may inure to the benefit of the insured. So if the insured, let's say, causes actually a vessel to sink at the dock, most times the law and the Coast Guard is going to come and say you have to raise that vessel, get it out of there, so and actually make sure that the waterways are clear. If the stevedore dropped something and it ended up damaging the vessel and the vessel sank at the dock, the Coast Guard most likely is going to say get it out of there. And then that's nice that this stevedore's legal liability would cover the removal of the wreck and any of the equipment on board or the cargo that was on board the vessel. It may be a very large claim. That's probably one of the biggest claims you might see in the stevedore's legal liability coverage. Then next, we're going to go over the terminal operator's legal liability coverage. Terminal operator is someone who is also offloading cargo but maybe storing it for a little bit, and things like that. There are a little bit more, lots more going on in a terminal than just stevedore. But what is covered is property damage to the watercraft, equipment, cargo, freight, and other interest on board such watercraft while it's in the care, custody, control of the insured for the purpose of berthing, docking, loading, or unloading at the location scheduled below. So again, this is actually covering something that would be, just if the vessel was just standing there and nothing was even being offloaded, and something that happened because the dock was not done well, and the terminal operator was responsible for not maintaining the dock very well. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that everything's being offloaded. That's kind of the difference. And it also covers the cargo being offloaded and loaded too. It also covers property damage to other watercraft, their cargo or freight, or any fixed or movable objects or property of others caused by the watercraft above. So what would happen then is, let's say, for instance, you had a vessel that was docked there and you're offloading cargo and you have not secured the vessel properly, and the wind comes and takes and breaks the lines and the vessel then goes away from the dock and ends up slamming into another vessel or somebody else's property. That would be covered underneath the terminal operator's legal liability in this clause. The next in this coverage of the terminal operators is property damage to other watercraft, their cargo or freight, or any fixed or movable objects caused by the loading or unloading of the watercraft above. Again, that's something if you're offloading a container and you drop it onto another vessel, that's covered by this policy. It covers the property damage that the terminal operator has done to other things. Let's say they are offloading a container and they end up dropping it onto the crane that's not owned by the terminal. Then it's covered underneath here too if they've caused the damage. Then property damage to property of others occurring while such property is in the care, custody, control of the insured, in which results arising out of the insured's operation or activities of terminal operators scheduled in 1A above. What that is doing is the property damage to the property of others while it's in your care, custody, control. That is just something that if the terminal operator has, they borrowed some property that they're going to use to offload the vessel or something like that, and it caused damage to it. It's covered if they're legally liable for it. Then the last thing is a thing that really is important is the cost or expense of the incidental to the removal of wreck of watercraft covered under 1A above, and the equipment, and shall be reduced by the net proceeds of salvage, cargo, and other interest on board, while it's in the care control of the insured, and while such removal is compulsory by law. It is agreed that the cost or expense may inure to the benefit of the insured. So that is covering if the vessel sinks while the terminal operator is working on the vessel or just has it there. They just have it parked there for a little while and it sinks because of something the terminal operator did. This is covering all of that liability to get that vessel out of the way and get all of the cargo that may have been on the vessel back and paid for, and all of the claims covered. Next is, with respect to watercraft in the care, custody, and control of the insured above, this insurance attaches from the moment the watercraft becomes at risk of the insured at the locations and scheduled on the policy, and continues until removed from the location schedule or until no longer at risk of the insured, whichever shall first occur. However, in the event of temporary removal of watercraft due to an emergency to within 5 miles of the location scheduled in 1A, and provided that the insured remains in the care, custody, control of such watercraft, this insurance will continue as if said watercraft was at the location scheduled in 1A. What this does is, let's just say the terminal has a fire on it. Well, that vessel, may not necessarily have people that are able to get it away from the dock. So the terminal may ask tugs to take it away and anchor it off at a location. Well, what it's saying is that even while that thing is anchored away from the dock, because of the fire or the damage that could possibly occur, it will still be covered for the legal liability of anything that happens to that vessel and the cargo and things on the vessel because of that fire or whatever accident that is happening at the terminal itself. This is a broad coverage and gives a lot of things that, is not necessarily at the terminal's control. It may be very, very crazy going on, and so the terminal takes and moves that vessel slightly off and away and into an area where it might have other vessels coming in that might damage it and hit it. So this is a good thing to have in the policy. So here are some of the exclusions. All of the normal CCC exclusions that I went forward at first are in most of these policies, but also loss, damage, or expense caused by or resulting from arising out of the watercraft repair, alteration, maintenance, construction, conversion, or gas freeing. These things are some things that are not necessarily, what a stevedore should be doing or a terminal should be doing. They shouldn't be necessarily repairing or altering the vessel. That is ship repairer's legal liability, which we've gone through in different times. And this is stuff that they really shouldn't be doing, that they don't really know. If they do these things at their terminal, or the stevedore may do some repairs, then you should ask for a stevedore, in addition to the stevedore or terminal operators, a ship repairer's coverage to be there too. Loss, damage, or expense caused by arising out of the exceeding of rated lifted capacity of any crane, travel lift, or other lifting device. So let's say this is saying that the terminal should be very aware of how much they're lifting and putting on the vessel and how much that their crane or that they're utilizing can stand to lift. For instance, you might have a crane that only can lift 5 tons and they try to lift 10 tons. The crane is going to collapse and cause damage to the vessel. This is saying that that's not covered. I have seen that exclusion be deleted because sometimes it's somebody that's a different operator operating the crane and the terminal isn't doing it because they have somebody else doing it. It's something that you should watch out for, and it can happen. But this is a very common exclusion, and I understand why it's there, because you really should be careful as an operator to make sure that you're not lifting anything more than the crane can possibly lift. And then what else is excluded is loss, damage, or expense resulting from unexplained disappearance or inventory shortages. Especially on a terminal, they may have stuff go into a warehouse until the truck is going to pick up the cargo. And all of a sudden the stuff is just gone, and they don't know how because, there was no burglary that was done or anything else. This isn't saying that, hey, if there's a missing stuff and no one knows why or whatever, then the answer is it's not covered. There should be alarms or some control of the inventory to make sure that there are no shortages. And so I understand why this is there, and it's a very common exclusion in policies. So when do we use stevedores, terminal operators, legal liability? The answer is anytime you have a stevedore who is not actually doing anything other than unloading the vessel, you should use that coverage. However, if you have a stevedore who's also operating the terminal, make sure you use the terminal operator's legal liability. That's an important part. If it's just unloading, stevedore liability is fine. However, if he's storing anything, if he's moving anything after it's off the vessel, and kind of doing more than just unloading vessels, get the terminal operator's liability. It may cost a little bit more, but it's much broader coverage. And then let's review some things. We had the Wharfinger's legal liability. That's for the storage of vessels, mooring vessels, and docking vessels. Very, very common, but not very broad coverage. The stevedore's legal liability is for the loading and unloading of cargo. No storage involved. It's just the unloading and loading of the cargo and the damage you might cause while doing that. The terminal operators gives you the storage of cargo opportunity. It covers containerized stuff, and it would, if you are careful, it might cover some of the liquid and bulk commodities that are being offloaded. Bulk commodities very much need terminal operators' legal liability because a lot of times you'll have a big pile of the removed things sitting on the terminal. So some of the exclusions that you might see, some of the contractual liabilities are almost always excluded, so be careful of that. A lot of these terminals and stuff will go above and beyond and put stuff in their contract to cover more than what is contractually allowed by law, and so therefore they may need even broader coverage, but that's something that is a typical exclusion in most policies. Demurrage is also a very common exclusion. Again, it should not be in the contract for most of these places, so make sure that you review the contracts that your insured does with other companies that they're working for. And then other care, custody, control coverages. Things like jewelry and things like that are not going to be covered in here. So if somebody is covering jewelry, then you're going to need specifically jeweler's block or something like that. The care, custody, control does not cover any owned property, and typically does not cover bodily injury in any way, shape, or form. Typically, you're going to get an MGL policy to cover that. I thank you for your time and efforts, and anybody has any questions, feel free to ask me questions now. Thanks very much, and I appreciate your time here.